All right, cool. So today I'm joined by Louis Betty. Louis is an associate professor of French at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. He is the author of the book Without God, Michel, Houellebecq, and Materialist Horror, which is published by the Pennsylvania State University Press. In addition to Without God, Dr. Betty has also published numerous articles on Houellebecq and, in the summer of 2021, translated a short essay by Houellebecq for unheard.com. He is currently living in Madison, Wisconsin. All right, Louis, maybe you could just begin by talking to us about your interest in Houellebecq. How did you get interested in it?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Well, in 2007, 2008, I was living in France. I was 25 years old, just a part of my grad school program to go over there and teach English. So I'm living in Aix-en-Provence, lovely town, and I'm enough of the way through grad school that I know that I have to figure out a dissertation, right? Something to write about. And I really had no idea. And I read about Houellebecq, as it were, kind of strangely enough, in an article in Time magazine called The Death of French Culture. And he was cited as the kind of decadent figure who, whose literary quality was kind of a suggestion of a decline in French, prominence culturally or literarily. So, of course, I hear something like that. He's a controversial guy, and I think, well, I got to go check this guy out. So I go and I buy his books at the Fnac, as it's called in France, and start reading them. And the other side of that story is that when I was an undergrad, I majored in religious studies. I've always been interested in religion as a topic academically. And, I knew that Europe was a place where you had, I don't know if I would call it a rampant, but a pretty serious secularism. It's contrasted very much with what you see in the United States. Christianity has declined somewhat here, but compared to what you have in Europe, it's still a very religiously vibrant part of the world. So I was interested in the phenomenon of, churches, these beautiful cathedrals that are empty, there's nobody in them for mass. And I saw that Houellebecq was talking about that in his novels, and that his novels seemed to be just informed by a kind of anthropological, you might call it law or platitude, that societies that shed their religious tradition tend to fall into decline or decadence. So, he just brought together a lot of things that were interesting me in the area of literature, in the area of France, religion, secularism, and all those kinds of things. So that once I had read enough, I brought that back to my thesis advisor and the committee, and they were a little bit suspicious. And they thought, who is this sort of provocative character that you're going to write about? You're going to get in trouble. Nobody's going to want to hire you. But I persisted and eventually did the dissertation, got onto the book. But yeah, it began just as a kind of dalliance when I was 25, living in Aix, looking for somebody to write a dissertation about. Mm-hmm.
So the title of the book is Without God, Michel, Houellebecq, and Materialist Horror. And you begin by sort of talking about like the materialist worldview. It might be good to just begin by talking about the materialistic worldview. What is it? And why did you call your book Houellebecq and Materialist Horror?
So the simple answer to what materialism is that it's a worldview where you just evacuate or blow out the airlock, as I like to say, any sort of transcendence of an immaterial kind. So what we tend to think of is a spirit, or I guess in the kind of Christian rhetoric, you put it in terms of the one God, right, who exists beyond the world in the form of a trinity, and then the human soul. And those are the traditional elements in the Western mind of what constitutes a spiritual transcendent reality. So there are other ways to think about that in other religious traditions, but in ours, that's the terminology. So if you evacuate that and say that all just doesn't exist, all that you have is the immanent world. There's no, nothing so optimistic as life after death, right? This is all there is. So in the simplest sense, that's what materialism is. It's I guess a way to put it is it's a way of thinking about our relationship with eternity. Right? Instead of eternity being something that we are a part of in some sort of conscious or personal sense, it's something that we're occupying a tiny little place in. Right? I think Unamuno called it, a flash of light between two eternities of darkness. And that's the materialist way of looking at it. And there are other, you can get as complicated as you want talking about materialism. It's an idea you find in Marxism, but it's more about human consciousness being structured by material conditions. So it's related in some way to an atheist materialism, but the sense that I'm engaging when I'm engaging with Houellebecq is that more spiritual or theological or religious sense of materialism as being the evacuation of any kind of notion of God or soul, to go back to those terms. And as for why I use the term in the book, well, it's of Houellebecq's own invention. And he says, it's in his letters, what's it called? Right, Public Enemies, the letters he has with him and Bernard-Henri Lévy. He says, I think that all I've ever really written are materialist horror stories. He says, conte d'épouvante matérialiste. I thought, that's probably the best description that this guy's ever given of his own work. And so as soon as I read that, the whole project kind of flowered in an instant. It was one of those moments of intuition. So yeah, it wasn't my own term. I can't claim to have invented it myself. It's there in Houellebecq.
Okay, so I think that description is good. When you read academic literature about Houellebecq, you notice there's a tendency to describe him as a sort of critic of neoliberalism, which is obviously true. But I think that's a sort of shallow interpretation of his work. It fails to address the fact that his work is centrally concerned with religion rather than capitalism. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Maybe talk about the academic reception that he's received and why you think this idea that, this sort of talk about neoliberalism is perhaps a little bit shallow.
Yeah, I think the more, the reception of him as a critic of neoliberalism is a bit more at the initial stages of scholarly engagement. In the last 5 or 6 years, I think my book hopefully had some influence on this. There's been more of an interest in the religious element. In France, there was a volume just published called Misère de l'homme sans Dieu, which is Misery of Man Without God. It's a whole series of scholarly essays that are getting at this question. So the debate has changed. But yeah, initially the idea was, this is a guy who, is sort of bemoaning the Americanization of European culture, the importation of American-style consumerism, hedonism, and all that. And as you said, that's superficial. If you look at Houellebecq, neoliberalism, just as much as other ideologies that were spun out of the Enlightenment, communism, socialism, these are all just symptoms, right, of a more fundamental shift in metaphysical assumptions in the West that go back to the end of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and then the 18th century. So if you take a movement away from the assertion of a real transcendence at the heart of human life and human society, if you take that out of the picture, then slowly you drift right into a more materialistic world, and eventually consumer capitalism and neoliberalism comes to fill that. So the idea is that, if you had a society that insisted and believed strongly and was able to impose, right, a religiously grounded notion of reality and what the purposes and ends of human life are, you would never have a situation like we have in the West where, basically the merchant class and the conservatives of money have been able to rise to the top of the social pyramid and dominate down. So yeah, the neoliberal critique is just part of a larger critique of materialism. And I think scholars really didn't see that initially because we tend to be so trained in, sort of generally Marxist derived critical theories, right? And to kind of jump out of that framework, I think initially was maybe unexpected or just difficult. But I think it's opened up quite a bit more now. This sort of willing to grant religion, right, a certain pride of place, and I don't even say a pride of place, but like acknowledging that it's a principal axis of they call axes of inquiry. Like it's a principal way of getting at reality. It's not something that is just fluff on the top of some sort of more materialistic explanation of the world. So, yeah.
When I first when I was reading your book, and I read what you had to say about the sort of shallowness of that critique, I couldn't help but think about maybe the left wing critique of modernity more broadly, about how it has a tendency to view all the problems of modern life as somehow derivative from like capitalism, and how there is a sort of shallowness to that critique of modernity, in that like the problem of modernity probably has a lot more to do with the death of God, right? Than just capitalism. But we might just go to the next question. Houellebecq is often described as a reactionary author. Do you think this is true?
No, and I, there was in 2002 there was again, I can't recall the author, but there was a book that came out called The New Reactionaries. It was called The Call to Order, and it criticized Houellebecq as being some kind of crypto-Catholic reactionary who wants, as all reactionaries do, to return to a former time where, gender roles are more sorted out. There's a structure of family life, sexual hedonism, and all that stuff has been restrained. That's a misunderstanding of what he's trying to do as a writer. He's not trying to urge any sort of return. I mean, the guy said over and over again that he's a sort of a writer of entropy. Right? He's there to show, in fact, that once a process of decline has begun, there really is no reversing it. So he's in some ways a kind of almost Christian, sort of romantic or nostalgic, but there's no sense in his work that I've ever detected that there could be a return. I mean, somebody like Eric Zemmour in France right now, the populist guy who's running for president. I don't know. That guy's a real reactionary. He's like, no, France was greater before. We need to get back to that. Whereas Houellebecq might say, yeah, maybe it was better before, but you can't go backwards in history. So I can nostalgically lament things that have been lost and romantically pine for whatever it happens to be. But no, reaction, that's just not part of his nature as a writer or an artist.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that, I feel like that naturally leads to the next question, which is so he believes that we can't return to a Christian culture. And yet he believes that a society, you've already said this, a society cannot exist without religion. So obviously then, there's Europe's in some sort of state of decay because of its lack of religion. So what are some alternatives to European secularism that he envisions? And do you think they are plausible?
That's a good question. I think what you just in your question, you kind of pointed out the tragedy of Houellebecq's, I guess you say the tragedy of the civilization or the culture that Houellebecq's painting in his novels, a culture that's totally aware of the problem, but incapable of furnishing any kind of solution, or at least getting back to the essential one, which is, its native ancestral religion. That's something you find in Pascal. And I think that Pascal is, he sees who Houellebecq is, even though he's writing 400 years previously, or Houellebecq sees himself in him. But Pascal says, people who boast of throwing off the yoke and they think they're very clever for being atheists and they've liberated themselves and made themselves happy, he thinks people like that are foolish. He thinks they're under some sort of spell. But people who sincerely lament their doubting and who seek in spite of doubting and sort of doubt in spite of seeking, he has respect for them. There's a kind of dignity in that. And I see Houellebecq as being that sort of person who is constantly seeking in his novels after some solution to the dead end of materialism, but without really finding it. And so that strikes me as a kind of tragic quality.
I think part of his huge appeal to people is that a lot of people have, let's call it this nostalgic quality, right? They look back to the Christian culture and their country's native religion, and they see that it was that there were many advantages to that way of life, and yet, even if they were to actually try and become religious, they somehow can't. So they very much meet Pascal's description of someone who seeks but cannot find. And I think that explains his appeal, is that a lot of people are in that position where they have this yearning for religion and they seek in many ways, but because of that inability to return, as you talked about before, they they can't do that. Like I would actually put myself in that sort of category. I feel like I'm someone who definitely experiences that, and I feel like that's why he spoke to me so much, is because just continuing on that, I think Houellebecq is someone who obviously respects Christianity and the Christian culture, and yet he seems to embody all of the characteristics of like modern degeneracy, right? And I think that there's a lot of people in that position as well, where they're critical of the culture they live in, but they cannot help but they have been produced by it. You know what I'm saying? Like they
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not even like a hypocrisy. It's like a kind of inevitability. Like this is who, I can try all I want not to, be a person of the modern world, but it envelops me and it's going to suck me in. So, how do you move from beyond that? Pascal's advice is just to go to church. There's a famous, his most famous thing is the wager, where he talks to the gamblers and says, hey, these are the reasons you should believe in God. You have nothing to lose. And then the gambler tells them, oh, I totally see what you mean, Pascal. That makes sense. I should believe in God. But then he says, but I'm so constituted or so made that I just can't. So what do I do? And Pascal says, well, this is like a very Catholic sentiment rather than a Protestant one, I think. You just have to kind of fake it till you make it. You have to go to masses. You have to take holy water, and then you'll start to believe as if by your animal instincts, he says. In the Protestant tradition, the idea is that you get your thoughts right? You have to figure out what you believe before you engage in ritual or worship. But from a Catholic point of view, the experience is much more embodied. It's about doing it, and then that grows something within you. At the same time, Houellebecq talks in his letters with Lévy about being a young man in his 20s and then into his 30s, going to mass, going to religious services, and having moments of effervescence, as Durkheim would say, during a mass, and for 5 minutes or so believing in God. But then when he exits the church and walks for 5 minutes in the streets of Paris, it all disappears, right? Because the city, I think he says this elsewhere, the city wasn't, the city is made by man, and if something is made by God, I guess it's the countryside. But just to enter into just the physical reality of the modern world is already to dissipate any kind of
that's what I think Joseph Campbell said, like atheism is just like the natural condition of someone living in a city, which I think is true. Like it's that's
a great way of putting it.
So we said Pascal, right? So Pascal obviously thought you should just go to church, but Houellebecq began to envision potentially different ways of thinking that would ultimately replace Christianity and then European secularism. Perhaps we could talk about some of those visions that he had.
Yeah, I mean, in the elementary particles, and then in the possibility of an island, which is kind of the sequel to it, you have genetics, quantum physics, cloning cults. So it's the techno-utopian sort of Silicon Valley version of utopia or a solution. So at the end of the elementary particles, the human race is perfected by a kind of positive eugenics. It's not super clear in the novel exactly how that works, because how could it be? It's a work of fiction, and he's not a genetic scientist. But in any case, something is done to alter the human genome so that we don't perceive ourselves as individual atoms anymore. There's a sense of connectivity between people. There's talk of Krauss corpuscles in the novel. I don't know if you remember this, where human beings are suddenly covered in these sort of orgasmic.
It's like they're basically like a big vagina.
Yeah, basically it's something like that. And so they just rub each other and they feel connected and together. And this is kind of a utopian thing. But then you get into the possibility of an island, and you have, I guess you could try to, I don't know if you should try to connect the novels or not, but it's the same sort of scenario where you have a cloning cult, and these sort of altered humans have been produced, and they're living in isolation this time and trying to keep up a kind of pure diet of asceticism. But it ultimately falls apart, and the clone narrator, I think he ends up wandering off into the dried up ocean and considers his attempt to transcend the limits of the flesh or of human life to be a failure. So that novel to me kind of marks the end of the techno-utopian attempt to solve the modern dilemma. I mean, in platform, you have sexual utopia.
Mm.
right? But that gets blown up, right, by terrorists. So that ends up being a dead end. In the map and the territory, I think that art is offered as a kind of consolation. Right? The main character is an artist, but even there, art doesn't escape the inevitability of extinction or annihilation. The final art project in that novel is human beings being consumed by plants that overgrow them. So even art ultimately is swallowed up by nothingness or by infinity. Then, of course, you have Islam in submission, and that's the most interesting one. For a couple of reasons. I mean, one, because it's so polemical, right? Because there's so much anxiety in Europe about the presence of Islam and Islamism and great replacement and cultural change, and all this rhetoric that goes around it. But I think what makes it compelling more is that we're simply dealing with like an extant religious tradition, right? Okay, cloning cults, Silicon Valley, that's all kind of outlandish. But Islam is a real thing.
Yeah.
Right? And, that's why the novel's so alarming, because people sense, right? They sense an absence of religion. I think that there's a kind of just this sort of anthropological instinct in people that they can't do without some explanation of the world that makes reference to final causes. And so you have a real competitor with a tradition, right, that's elaborated over 1,000 years present in your society that's going to make itself felt and going to be threatening to people. So
I feel like for me personally, my two favorite novels would be Atomized and Submission. I don't know why, but they were the first two that I read, and I just feel like personally they were the best. Submission is often, described as like a sort of Islamophobic book, but that just strikes me as the most absurd interpretation. It's not, you say in the book, it's not Islamophobic. It's probably Francophobic, if anything.
No, I agree with you on that. I think, as when the novel was coming out, you had Francois Hollande saying that, like, we have to be careful with this novel because it could be a voice of hatred. He hadn't read it yet, but he promised to. And then you had the whole horrific Charlie Hebdo thing, that coincidence between the appearance of the novel on the same day as that attack. But as people started digesting the novel, Mark Lilla had a really good piece in, I believe it was the New York Review of Books, where he said, this novel is not about Islam. This Islam is basically just a prop to further explore the excesses or the ravages of unhinged liberal Enlightenment thinking. And that it's made all the more powerful by the fact that Islam is a living religious tradition, right? It's a real present foil to the way we order our lives, or officially order our lives in the West. With Russia and Putin and all that, we seem to be entering our hysterical phase. So I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. But yeah, I mean, I've had to push back against people in conferences who say, "Oh, this novel's a lot Islamophobic." Well, if you want to find Islamophobic content in Houellebecq, there are other places to look, like much more ready stuff. In some of his comments in interview before he got sued for saying that Islam is the stupidest religion, things in Platform that certain characters say. But Submission, no. I mean, Submission, it kind of honors Islam at the very least. If you're a committed secularist or you're a Christian or whatever it is, at least this is a religious system that is a religious system, essentially, that's trying to reorder human life around some kind of transcendent principle. And the Islam in that novel it's not ISIS, right? It's not the Islamists you find in the French suburbs. It's a very gentle form.
I can't remember who the what his name is, the sort of like intellectual voice of Islam. But can you remember in Submission? Anyway, you probably know
Robert Rediger, who becomes the president of the Islamic University of the Sorbonne, because like Saudi oil dollars, they're funding the university. And he's kind of a charismatic figure who's written this book about 10 questions on Islam. And he becomes a proselytizer, obviously for Islam, but also for theism too. So it's a bit of both. And
he's inspired by G.K. Chesterton's Third Position, where it's like a sort of synthesis between, I guess, like capital, not a synthesis between capitalism and socialism, but this emphasis on like the family business as opposed to like the mega corporation. But the thing that's perhaps most interesting about him is he's almost more following the prophet Nietzsche than Muhammad. I feel like that if my memory serves correct, he seems to be more inspired by him. And he makes the point throughout, there is this sense both in real life and in the novel that Europeans are tired, right? And that with that tiredness comes this inability to really assert yourself, or just like that you're too tired to assert yourself or to assert your culture. So you get the impression in the book that people are not happy with the fact that like the secular culture is being replaced, but nobody has the sort of vitality to actually resist. So Islam sort of depicted as this masculine, energized, vital religion, which sort of is able to progress unabated just because the host culture has become so exhausted. Well,
the interesting question is, of course, where does this exhaustion come from exactly? And I guess the closest place to look is the wake of the Second World War, right? Where you had this consensus that emerged that Europeans had to become open and had to become tolerant and embrace the other, because their natural disposition for doing things, which is rooted in nationalism and a certain kind of ethnocentrism, you might say, led to all sorts of disaster. And so if you're acculturated into thinking that like the instincts of your culture, your civilization are dangerous just in and of themselves, then you're going to step aside because you're going to think, well, anything is better than us, going back to what we were. So in some respects, maybe it's the exhaustion of an old culture. It's hard for me to assess, and maybe for you too, because we come from pretty new countries. I don't know what it's like to be a French person, to feel that weight of history. But I think there is a kind of education into suspicion of your own convictions that you might have. And I think that's starting to lift a little bit. That's why you see various populist movements sprouting up in Europe. And of course, that terrifies people who still dwell within that post-war consensus. But it's perhaps, the world is just changing, and what was adaptive, in 1950, right, is becoming maladaptive now, that you have challenges having to do with cultural change, immigration, Islam. So, I don't know to what extent Houellebecq really takes that up in his own work, but he is part of that broader discussion about, I guess, shifting out of the post-war moral consensus.
And also that is a discussion that is obviously taken up throughout the novel Submission by that activist. Again, I can't remember his name, but the protagonist talks to this sort of like nativist throughout who that's right. who makes very similar arguments to kind of what you've just said in a way. I thought maybe we could return to because obviously Houellebecq's envisioning all of these alternatives to European secularism, because like you said, any culture that doesn't have a religion is in a state of decay. So there needs to be some sort of religion. And we've spoken about these sort of techno cults that emerge, like these clone cults. And we've spoken about Islam as a potential alternative to Christianity. I thought what we might do is, in a way, backtrack.
Sure.
The reason he thinks that is because he thinks that materialism as a worldview, which is to say an atheistic worldview, essentially, where all that matters is material. I think it relates back to Schopenhauer, like Schopenhauer's pessimism. Schopenhauer, I think, would often talk about like animals. He would look at the animal world. And I think that that's in a way where a lot of his pessimism came from, is because he saw, if you look at these animals, like they're all driven by this, I guess you'd call it like a will to life. And it's just like constant slaughter in order to preserve yourself. And he just said, like that sort of will to survival. It's sort of like that's the driving force behind everything. and it's inherently this sort of like evil thing, I guess. And that what we need to do is we need to negate the will. We need to negate the will and embrace a sort of he was in some ways he was like the first European Buddhist, I guess. Like, we need to negate the will. And I think that religion, like Christianity, there's obviously a lot of aestheticism. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it seems to me that like his utopias, they either embrace this fact, right, that we need to negate the will, we need to return to religion, or they go and do the opposite, which is like they fundamentally reshape the nature of reality. I don't know. Maybe this is a good segue to talk about Schopenhauer, I guess.
Well, I think that dynamic that you're saying, like going one way or the other, the tensions between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, that shows up in the possibility of an island.
Yeah.
And that's the most Schopenhauerian of Houellebecq's novels. I know that he spent a lot of time just studying Schopenhauer intensely before he began writing that novel.
Sorry, that's actually, I got lost in thought, and I realized now that you say that, I'm like, oh, that's why I brought it up, is because I wanted to talk about it in relation to that book. Yeah. So
I mean, you can think of that particular utopian, I don't know, inclination is trying to enact or sort of perform the denial of the will to live. Right? You have these clones living in an isolated situation. They've more or less removed. I mean, there's just no contact between them. And there's a remote contact, but there's no physical contact. And so they're trying to, you can think about it that way. This is an attempt to deny the will to live, but it ends up being a failing experiment, though, in that novel. It's like Nietzsche ends up reasserting himself. Like, there's a passage he says, like, as long as there's organic life, right, there's going to be a will to power, the need to consume others. And so, it's almost as if in the novel, Houellebecq wanted to find some kind of solution through Schopenhauer, right? The belief that the rejection and the taming of the will would be sufficient, but that all falls apart by the end, right? And again, Nietzsche comes back on the scene. But I mean, like you said, I mean, the animal world is that was Schopenhauer. I mean, I teach Schopenhauer to students, and I tell them, the way to think about this is like the movie Alien, where, your body is being used by this horrific creature, and it's going to like burst out of your chest in this show of indifferent will to you. So, I mean, that's my point, right? That the possibility of an island, I think that it does enact that tension between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, but Nietzsche ends up winning at the end.
You can say that Schopenhauer perhaps is an example of materialistic horror, right? Where he obviously it was prior to Darwin, he was one of the first thinkers, I think, to realize, like, hang on a second, a lot of these notions that we have, the free will of the spirit, they're not true. He adopted instead a materialistic worldview. And when he adopted that view, it quickly led to horror and a rejection of life, where he went and said, well, this sort of will to life is something that needs to be negated. Now, that obviously pervades a lot of the books, as we've just said. The utopias that Houellebecq invents are utopias in which science is used to modify organic matter and make it somehow different, so the will doesn't dominate as much. But it's weird because I've heard him say, or at least I've seen quotes where he says, I sided with Schopenhauer in the fight against Nietzsche. And I imagine that Houellebecq's thoughts, like a lot of us, it changes. So perhaps there are times where he's more Schopenhauerian than Nietzschean. Like, I think that Submission, for example, was in many ways validation of Nietzsche over Schopenhauer in some ways. And obviously the possibility of an island was a rejection of Schopenhauer. So do you think that this is like an ongoing debate in his mind, or do you think he firmly sides with Schopenhauer?
Well, I mean, it's hard to speak to the nature of the artistic product. I mean, his own comments, outside of his fictional writing have been that, he's firmly on the side of Schopenhauer because Schopenhauer is rooted in compassion, right? And that's the Buddhist connection. In terms of how the novels play out, though, you're right. I mean, in Submission, you end up with a society that is what's the word? Why can't I think of the word? Polygamous, right? Where certain men, they have 3 or 4 wives. You see that with the character who's running the Sorbonne, and of course, others going to be left with none. And so that is a total absence of compassion and an assertion of the male will, or the will of the strongest male to dominate and even take away the reproductive capacities of the latter.
And also, just quickly, Louis, maybe if you can remember, I forgot his name again, the intellectual voice of Islam. The grounds on which polygamy is defended in his book, The 10 Reasons for Islam, is actually Darwinian. Yeah, it's literally Darwinian, where he says, like men who are closest to, God should procreate more. It's, and it's just on sort of eugenic grounds that this practice is justified. Yeah. So, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's like, this is how the human race goes about sustaining itself. That's again, I don't know what explains that sort of, somebody who is so sympathetic to Schopenhauer. I mean, the catch in that novel is that that's expanded to intellectuals or college professors as well, because there's a virility in intellectualism. So, but yeah, I mean, is Houellebecq ultimately a Nietzschean in his thinking, or a Schopenhauerian? I mean, I think he's probably ideally a Schopenhauerian, like he wants to in his own life, live according to compassion. I mean, recently he's written some essays about, or a particular essay about euthanasia, right? And he just vehemently opposed to the practice of it. He sees it as just an abdication of your responsibility to people who are old and suffering, and it's just treating old life as a kind of refuge that gets in the way of decadent youth. So in his idealistic self, he's very much beholden to Schopenhauer and the notion of compassion and love for creatures. But what he's living in, I suspect, what he thinks he's living in is a world that's just been totally won over by the Nietzschean perspective. And so that's really the tension, right, between his idealism and what he sees. And so as it manifests in various novels, it's gonna go one way or the other, as we see in in the stuff you just mentioned.
Yeah, so I think that's naturally like a good segue to maybe discussing like his commentary on sex and sexuality. He has a quote where I can't remember in what novel, but where he talks about how basically like the slogan of our time is youth and beauty and strength. And he's like, and it's basically was the slogan of like the Nazis.
It's the possibility of an island that he says that.
Yeah, possibility of an island. Yeah. So it's basically like the slogan of the Nazis. But there's a sort of a Darwinian, if you will, aspect to modern dating, where you notice like on these, you've probably seen this dating app data where you see like 10% of the men on Tinder or whatever, they tend to basically get 90% of the women. And some have speculated that this is in a way a reversion to like a primordial state, where if you look at like DNA data or whatever, they found that this actually was the case in a sort of previous state where it seemed like basically the vast majority of men would not procreate. Obviously, he has that quote, which is very famous from whatever, where it's like, sex was a sort of second system of differentiation. Perhaps we could just talk about that. Like, I think that this appeals to people. Houellebecq's, I think he's sort of sympathetic to what would now be called the Incel. Like, he thinks there's some truth to what they say. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there was I think it was 2018 or 2019, after that attack in Canada that killed several people by somebody who was spouting incels.
Is it Elliot Rogers? Is that who you're talking about? Or
yeah, I think so. And there was a similar thing that happened in Santa Barbara, California, a few years previous. And this article, it was in the New York Times, made the connection that, it said, there was an author back in the 90s writing in France who had predicted sexual dystopia. That was the term he used. The way that that comes to be, though, in the way in Houellebecq's, in whatever at least, is that it's an extension of market logic from the domain of consumer products, cars, or whatever it is that you want to buy, into the domain of sexuality. And that's what you see being manifested in these dating apps, that the human being becomes a body to be consumed, right? Sexually in this case, but still an object of consumption, rather than something that you honor, or is an object of procreation, which has which is directed toward another end other than just pleasure or egotistic satisfaction. So the idea is that when you extend market logic to sexuality, there's an inevitable differentiation or a hierarchy that emerges, because I guess the hard truth about it is that some people are more attractive than other people, or they're smarter, or they have more money, they're younger, or they're older, right? And the historic purpose of monogamy or religious systems that insisted on monogamy was to not allow that hierarchy to get out of control, because when it does, ugly things start to happen, as you see in Canada or in Santa Barbara. So you liberalize the sexual market at your own risk, right? Just as you liberalize any market.
I noticed that this to me seems to be like a blaringly obvious fact, right? And yet people tend to get very emotional when you make it, like if you show any sort of sympathy towards like the plight of the incel, where I think there is a lot of truth to what they say. A lot of them basically go and say like, I'm sort of a defective human being and there's no way that anyone will ever love me in a system where, you can sleep with as many people as you want. And people's reaction to that is to basically just stack on them and even there's a lot of people who will go and say things like, no, you're being, and there is some truth to this, you're being self-defeatist. And obviously there is some truth to that. But I think that there is actually a real truth to what they're saying. And that you can just detest that and ignore it and say it's sexist and all of this. But there's a growing number of people who meet that description. Yeah.
Yeah. You just say, well, you just shouldn't think that way. It's like, well, but they do. So you have to engage people with what they think and feel, with what they feel viscerally before you can engage them in an argument. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't have the numbers, but, I don't know to what degree or what percentage of men feel this kind of alienation, but it's obviously significant. And it's sort of like the dark side of the sexual revolution. The idea was to free people from all sorts of constraints that, at the time probably were oppressive. I mean, there were a lot of, there's a lot of unhappiness within traditional families, right? And the expectation of monogamy put all sorts of pressure on people to get married when they didn't want to or they weren't ready. But everything in society, right, when it comes to a social transformation, involves trade-offs, right? And so now we're seeing another kind of, on the one hand, you have sort of like the playboy figure, like the Donald Trump or the Hugh Hefner, who's just surrounded by beautiful women, right? But, for every man who has, I think Tolstoy says somewhere, for every Solomon who has 100 wives, there are 100 men with no wives. So I think that people get uncomfortable with that critique. I mean, I think part of it is some of the rhetoric. There's kind of a rhetoric of entitlement that you see in some of these online articles, like, I deserve these women, it's like, I'm sure you could find somebody to sleep with, but maybe they think, they deserve something better than what, they're able to get. But the real discomfort has to do with the criticism of the sexual revolution as something that wasn't just like this utopian thing that freed everybody up to live their best life, that it had a downside. And, that's a critique that much of the world doesn't want to hear, because we want to enshrine certain social transformations as these watershed moments that didn't have any downsides. But any sort of social transformation is going to involve these kinds of trade-offs. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to countenance.
So we've spoken about the utopias, and you mentioned the fact that Houellebecq, he obviously has, there's a lot of French sort of socialist utopians. You mentioned this in your book. When I read it, I kind of laughed, because when I was 18, I remember going to a bookstore And you know how like secondhand bookstores, they always have like these eccentric owners. And if you ask them for a recommendation, they'll sometimes, yeah, like this guy was obsessed with like French Utopian Socialists. So he just did a lot of the books that you talk about. He just basically recommended that I buy. So I've read English translations of a lot of their thought. But so the reason I mention this is I forget the French writer that you mentioned. His name starts with F, and he sort of came up
Fourier.
Who is it again?
Fourier.
Fourier.
Charles Fourier.
Yeah. Okay. So I haven't read him, but basically that he had a sort of a utopian solution to the problem of inceldom. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, he imagined that there would be a kind of court of love where you'd have these charitable, almost angelically generous younger people who would be there to service the needs of anybody who might need it. I mean, it was more directed toward the old, because I guess becoming elderly is like that's the ultimate loss of your capital in terms of sexuality. So Fourier imagined that in his ideal community, the phalanx or the phalanstery, as he called it, there would be a court of love that would see to these problems. I mean, there are other figures in French utopian thought who have imagined similar kinds of things, but Fourier's is kind of the most, the most kind of romantic. But
it's interesting that they actually that he saw it on similar grounds, because if you go and you recognize that sex is a system of differentiation, sort of like capital, we recognize in like the realm of capital that like the government can intervene to ease the pressures of inequality. And it's funny because I think throughout history, people have recognized that this logic can also be applied to sexuality. So I think that there's a play by a Greek dramatist, Aristophanes or whatever, where something similar happens. But then it's interesting that he suggested that this sort of technocratic, almost government solution to the problem of sexual inequality. It's creepy and weird, but you kind of go, there's
a certain logic to it.
Yeah, there is a certain logic to it. That's what I'm getting at. It's you're literally applying the same logic of socialist economics to sexuality, and this has actually been done throughout history. I think that people have made the connection between those two things. It's that's an interesting one. So I think that the last thing that I might ask you about before we talk about Houellebecq's latest book is just what is his relationship to feminism? You mentioned in the book, and I didn't know this, that he had actually written a sort of preface to a popular feminist book, I think. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, it was a radical feminist manifesto called the Scum Manifesto by Valerie Solanas. And I mean, if we just to greatly simplify, we can think of, say, like two branches of feminism. Like there's the Simone de Beauvoir feminism, which is like, women need to be able to be economically independent, and not count on men for all of their needs, et cetera. So it's a kind of women to work feminism and a way of leveling up and like being able to do as men do, more or less. And so the critique that you get from a more radical edge would be like, well, why should feminism just be like imitating men? Like what's so great about, the world of work and achieving the same in a career as a man does? Maybe there's something about women that actually departs from that world and should be asserted as a better model. And so Houellebecq in the Elementary Particles, I think especially talks about how the feminine and especially the maternal instinct is more worthy of dominating in our culture, because male instinct, as it becomes manifest in competition and work, capitalism actually kind of disorders the world because there's all this competition for wealth and power and for influence. And so a world that was more, you might say, essentialistically female would be gentler, would be less competitive, would be more peaceful, and would trace a much more gentle path through the world. So, I mean, that's a very that's a very essentialist kind of feminism. It's saying that like there's a thing called femininity that's very distinct from masculinity, and masculinity has to be pushed aside because it's too dangerous. So that kind of radical feminist critique is something that he, at least for a time, found to be very compelling, as against the more Simone de Beauvoir way of thinking about it, which was just sort of the leveling up of women against, to rise to the status of men. And so, I mean, I'm not an expert in feminism. There's probably a bit of tension between the two things, and they end up contradicting each other. But yeah, he gets accused of being a sexist and being an anti-feminist. But in some ways, he, again, embraces this very radical notion of feminism as being a solution to just the evils and the violence and the competitiveness of the essential male
character. That's interesting. Again, it seems to verify or validate what you said before about how in Houellebecq's nonfiction works, he always seems to sound like Schopenhauer, because what you just described, a more feminine world, according to that, would be one in which you are not as wedded to your own will. You can think about masculinity and the heroic and all of these things as very much the will to power is at the center of that a masculine sort of archetype. And I guess that the rejection of that is even in submission, right? Christianity is constantly described as a feminine religion, and I think that in that book they mentioned Nietzsche's critique that that basically Jesus was a woman or whatever, like he was a feminine sort of character. So that would seem to it's an interesting feminism where it seems to be wedded to the idea that this sort of Schopenhauerian worldview, that's what his feminism is essentially. It's the idea that does that sound right to you? I mean, maybe I'm mixing two things.
Well, I mean, kind of the irony of that criticism of Christianity is being sort of effete, sort of Christianity ends up being sort of the progressive religion par excellence at the same time, though, because it's eschatological. It holds out the idea that there's like an end of history, and so I think Houellebecq associates that the need to move history forward and to change things and progress with a kind of masculine energy, whereas you can make the argument that Christianity, in spite of the Nietzschean critique, is the most progressive of all religious systems. Whereas the Romans, for example, who were, you can just think of that as an ancient cult of masculine power in so many ways, were very much just about maintaining order. Right? It's we don't want to change things. We don't progress. We need to maintain order. So, that makes me a little suspicious of the Nietzschean critique. I mean,
I'm very sympathetic towards the Nietzschean analysis of modernity as basically just secularized Christianity. I wanted to talk to you about this because I saw your discussion of the French Utopians. They obviously were living at a time where I think you said the metaphysics of Christianity were being rejected and the belief in a literal God, but all of them were trying to essentially rationalize Christian ethics essentially. And I couldn't help but think, you sort of say that they were failures in the book. Now, of course, individually they were. Not many people really remember these people. And yet I couldn't help but think that liberalism, in a way, is what they were attempting to do, where it's a sort of secularized Christian ethic, of caring for the needy, so on and so forth. And that that if this was true, the Enlightenment wouldn't represent a huge break with Christendom, but the real break, the real change in basic metaphysical assumptions would be between the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world, and the Judeo-Christian. That in fact represents the serious break culturally. Because I just felt like those French Utopians, they sounded to me, they sounded like in many ways genuine Christians, right?
I mean, Christianity, the great book that deals with all of this is Tom Holland's Dominion. I don't know if you've read that.
I've been meaning to. I've heard really good things about it.
We're right in the middle of that discussion. And he says, secular European people, Western people, almost universally have deeply Christian assumptions about morality and what's right and wrong, right? That there's a duty to, there are two things, he says. On one hand, there's a belief in fundamental human equality, and that goes right back to St. Paul, right? There being neither Jew nor Greek, man or woman, free or slave. And then a concern for victims. And that's like, Christ in his dreadful disguise, when you see the least of my brothers, you behold me, right? And so that those two preoccupations still completely grip the West, right? But they're unmoored typically from the metaphysical assumptions. And Holland makes the point that, the reason that we react so viscerally against Nazism, right, is because Nazism represents the rejection of those two things, the cult of strength and fundamental inequality. And that's why it's such a demon in the Western mind. But it wouldn't have been too different from, well, I don't want to say that the Romans or the Greeks were Nazis, but they were certainly pre-Christian, states that were anyway.
They are. The reason this sounds like a tangent, but I think that it's relevant for the reason that I think that Houellebecq's description of modernity as somehow comparable to like that quote we discussed before: strength, beauty, and youth. Right? He said, this was essentially the motto of like the Nazi Party, right? Now, I don't know. For me, I guess what I'm trying to get at is I don't really think that atheism. I don't think that we're real atheists. And I think that if you wanted to see something like real atheism or paganism, you would look to a party like the Nazi Party. I feel like we still are committed to those. I think that this is perhaps something that isn't adequately addressed. And that in his book, he depicts the world as like, really selfish, really this, really that. But I think that there still remains to a huge extent that Christian ethos. But unfortunately, Anyway, what did you do?
Well, the question is, how long does that last once you've severed it from the metaphysics? Right? If people aren't actually, hearing the gospel, right, or reading the letters of St. Paul, like how many generations, does it take before you have a reversion to a crueler society? But the other argument is that, you get somebody who's, the Enlightenment thinker, the rationalist, the humanist who says, there is a break with Christianity and the Enlightenment, and it's possible to through reason, derive some kind of moral law. I've never been really very convinced by that, but that's always the counter argument you're gonna get when you're making this kind of argument. But I tend to be more on the side of, human beings' moral commitments. They do need to be grounded in some sort of religious story or metaphysical narrative. And when you remove that, all sorts of strange things can start happening. And they have been for the last 250 years, I suppose.
I think Christianity's commitment to altruism. I mean, like I think it's difficult to justify on purely rational grounds, right? Like there's elements of Christian altruism that seem to actually border on irrational, right? So that's why I've always been unsympathetic towards that explanation. Is there are instances in which you can see European cultures acting in a way that's altruistic, but actually in some ways really silly.
I mean, that's the whole issue with with immigration and
exactly. And prime example.
The necessity to be open, but it only works if the culture you're open to is going to play by the same rules. I mean, you see this in I've read a lot about Islamists in France and how they kind of operate, and they're very, very happy to use the democratic or humanist or generally classically liberal policies and laws in place to assert their identity, right? Oh, this is about respect for my identity. It's about tolerance. But what you find is it's really about ascendancy. But they know they're very clever in using that, you might say, vestigially Christian set of moral assumptions against the West. And the problem is that, any civilization has trouble seeing outside of itself and kind of assumes that its values are universal, and especially the West because of our history of, gallivanting across the world and creating Australia or the United States of America. But that assumption is being deeply tested right now. And it's hard to say what the results are going to be because, the minute you start making the critique that I'm making, people start thinking, we're going to not be open to others. We're going to turn people away. And then the next thing you know, you're back to the Third Reich, right? You get to the backstop, right, of all these comments that so.
Well, it's like almost any sort of national assertiveness. It kind of goes back to the tiredness that we spoke about before. Perhaps this is not so much like the philosophy of altruism as it is just a sort of tiredness and inability to actually assert yourself, right, culturally. Perhaps what we could talk about before we wrap up is his latest book. Now, at the moment, it's only out in French, I believe. You've read it. Perhaps you could just give us some of your thoughts about it without any spoilers. What do you think? Is it a good book?
Well, the title is interesting. I think first it's anéantir, which means to annihilate. So it's the infinitive form of the verb. So it's unconjugated. So that means how exactly is annihilation going to play out? We'll get into the lives of characters. This is a novel. I guess I'll say a couple things about it. One, it's a novel that is very much not about what it seems to be about initially. There's a kind of geopolitical intrigue, there's terrorism, there's a presidential election, and you kind of think, oh, this is where things are going. But then I'll just say there's a shift, right? And things become focused on something that's been going on the whole time that's a little bit subtler and more personal. And then that's what the last third of the novel is concerned with. In terms of, Houellebecq, there's always an element of social critique in his novels. And in this one, it's kind of COVID related. There's a lot of discussion of the horror of life in nursing homes in France and the medicalization of death. Something like 60% of French people die in some sort of healthcare facility, right, often alone. And the novel goes into that uncomfortable territory. What else I had to say about that?
Can I just say quickly what you said about the nursing home?
Cool.
I feel like because obviously I'm in Australia, so it's different. We spoke about this briefly before we started, but life is beginning or has resembled a nursing home for the last 2 years to a huge extent, where you have that sort of it's almost like it's an obsession with the preservation of life almost for its own sake, without any consideration of what that life is becoming or what life feels like, if that makes sense.
There's a...
I was just going to say it's a sort of nursing home philosophy that's pervading our culture.
There must be no death.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, I suppose, there's a French philosopher named Olivier Rey who has written quite a bit about this. He just had a good piece on the Figaro about how COVID came to occupy such a space in people's minds, and he says that human beings we're like general threat detectors. We're afraid of everything at some level, right? And so what happens is a weird swapping out that's ultimately very irrational, but it makes sense, like that human beings would do this. That like you focus on one danger that's the most present, or at least seemingly the most present, COVID. Right? COVID equals death. And then the thought emerges that, okay, well, if I can protect myself against COVID or against this particular disease, somehow I'm protecting myself against all death. So it's a way of condensing all the dangers of the world into one thing. And of course, that's not the true because people are ill and dying of all sorts of things. But it became a way of just dealing with mortal anxiety, especially in a culture where there's all this fear of, again, like being alone in a nursing home, dying in a healthcare facility without family around. So
didn't he write an article just on this topic of the nursing home? Didn't he write an article on COVID recently where he talked about like what life after COVID? Did you see this? Maybe not.
Yeah, it'll be. He said life will be the same, but just a little bit worse.
Yeah. And is that kind of what the book is about in a way? This new book that he's written?
I mean, maybe in some sort of tangential way. I mean, I think ultimately it's a very romantic book. It's about the, instead of, cloning cults or Islam or some sort of sexual utopia or art being a solution to, or at least a way of pushing back against the horror of the material world, it proposes the romantic love between two people as a way of allowing us to make our journey across life in a way that's a little bit less lonely, a little bit less terrifying. So that's all I want to say about it, though.
That's really, I feel like that sounds, I can't help but feel like that sounds surprisingly almost optimistic, but I don't know if that's a way of describing the book.
It's within a general backdrop of materialist horror, though, so you're never that optimistic when you're reading Houellebecq.
Okay, so maybe you could just talk a little bit. Last thing before we wrap up is just the short essay you translated for unheard.com. Could you speak to that a little bit, if that's all right?
Well, it's an interesting story. He had published something on euthanasia in the Figaro about a month and a half before that one that I had just seen and thought, maybe I can pitch this to somebody. I'll do a translation, get the rights from the Figaro, and they'll do it. And so I pitched an editor at Unheard who happened to have read my book, and he said, "Hey, yeah, let's do it. We'll pay the Figaro whatever, 800 euros or whatever it cost." And so I thought, okay, well, that was nice. I did a translation. But a couple of weeks later, this guy gets back to me and says, why don't we pitch Houellebecq directly and see if he'll write something for us? Like, we're going to commission him. And so I ended up doing that and emailing the publisher. The publisher passed it on. And I get an email from Houellebecq directly to me, which is sort of exciting, saying, yeah, I'll do it. And the topic was the letter of the generals. This was something that was in the spring of 2021. And so he agreed to do it. And it was really pretty thrilling to have delivered into your email box like this fresh text by this great author that like nobody else has seen, and you're going to translate it. I will say, though, that there was a back and forth between Houellebecq's agent and the folks at Unheard that was pretty incredible to behold. Right, it was very contentious, and I thought things would fall through at one moment or a couple of moments, but they eventually sorted it out. And so the piece came out. It's called "The Narcissistic Fall of France." I believe it was in early May or late April of 2021. So yeah, that was really exciting. I mean, I'm really at this point very interested in translation more generally. So probably the next thing I'll be working on is going to involve that, not with Houellebecq, but something else.
Anyway, this has been great, Louis. Thank you so much for joining me. Mm-hmm. Is there any parting comments you'd like to make? Where should people get in contact with you if they want to, or I don't know, just maybe some parting comments. What are you working on at the moment, so on and so forth?
Sure. Yeah, I'm very much interested in French political and cultural subjects right now, and so I'm trying to figure out a way to get a conversation going about a French writer who's extremely controversial named Renaud Camus, who was the guy who came up with the term "the Great Replacement." And the way that that's been appropriated, like in the Anglosphere, it ends up in the manifesto as psychopaths who shoot people up. But what he means by that term is something really, really different. And he's like a huge pacifist. So considering the way that term's been appropriated in bloody ways, I feel like there's some way to get a discussion going about anyway. But it's quite contentious. So I'm a little worried that I shouldn't even do it.
No.
Otherwise,
you should do it, because I feel like what happens is, because of the language barrier, people can get away with totally skewing what someone says just to for their own political advantage. So I think that
for him, it's really actually a critique of, in a lot of ways, of neoliberal capitalism, like the idea that creating a world in which things and people are interchangeable and therefore replaceable. I mean, there's a healthy dose of old school kind of French cultural chauvinism thrown in there, but it's really not a racist thing. And it's certainly not a conspiracy theory, because he says very clearly that this is not any sort of conspiracy. And that's the way it's been understood outside of France. And that's really toxic. So
so it's almost more like an idea, like a cog in a machine. You can be replaced. That there's nothing in an artisan obviously is unique, but the factory worker isn't and can just be replaced. Is that kind of what it is?
Yeah, I mean he's tracing the idea of what he calls replacism or remplacisme all the way back to, I mean, the Industrial Revolution. So it's almost like an aesthetic critique in some ways, or a moral or cultural one. It's not some sort of political program, even though he's been invested in politics for a number of years. But that's another story.
All right, well, cool. Thank you so much. I think this has been good. And we'll stop recording now. Have a good one. And
You
thanks
too.
for
Thank
coming
you.
on.